It seems like there's no end to the fun that can be had in playing with stories and applying them to our lives, designing the stories that we want to somehow make sense of and add a layer of meaning and interpretation on top of the mix of events that makes up our life and our world. We just seem to have the possibility of adding a story on top of anything. And knowing that we have the ability to modify the story, write new stories whenever we choose, change the stories, look at them in a new way, add a sequel, add a prequel, completely rewrite them, erase them, combine them, adapt them into a new genre, a new form. We can use this power to design the way that we want to look at life. And I think just starting from this idea that there is no built-in automatic story for our life. There's no story that's just there built in to life itself. That a story is always something that we apply on top of what happens. So at first, when I first started talking about that, it seemed like, okay, no stories. Enough with the stories, real life's not like a story. And, we shouldn't always feel like we have to think about everything like it's a story. But then from starting with that, the idea that there's no automatic built-in story, then it leads to the possibility that from this blank page, we can then build whatever story we want out of it. We can add any story, and in fact, not just one, but we can add a whole collection of stories of all different kinds to our lives. And it really is, maybe it's almost too much freedom, right? Because we can really do absolutely anything. And when you can do absolutely anything, sometimes it just leads to kind of being lost in the sea of possibility. But it does seem like this is our power and our possibility to really come up with any interpretation that we want. So, one of the first things that it leads me to think is, okay, there is not only one. There isn't just one story. We don't have to design the story of our lives because there's no way that a life can fit into one story, even the most massive story. So instead, we really can use the numbers. We can use the volume of stories. We can have so many different stories, different types, right? We can have a novel, we can have a play, a poem, we can have a whole mix of everything, anything you could possibly imagine. And we can have it not even a single united collection, but it can just be an entire mix of so many different layers. So imagine that each part of your life had its own story. Imagine that to really bring out that feeling of having the big range of different stories, that each part of your life could have its own story. Imagine like every room in your home has its own story. So it would just be focused on whatever happens in that room, and it could be a whole story of everything that happened in that room over time. And it would just be independent from everything happening in the other rooms or every place that you visit. So you could divide it by place. Imagine that each person you knew, imagine you had a story for each person you have a connection with, and the story of your connection. Each pair of two people in the world could have their own story just about the connection of those two people. And you could take it even further to even, could have objects. Each object could have its own story. Imagine each piece of clothing. Every pair of shoes that you have has its own story for all the time you were wearing those shoes. And, you know, just by thinking of it this way, we can really find ways to really see that the number of stories is just so big. And, you know, we can really zoom in on each part of our lives and make a full story out of it. And yet even then, that story is only one piece. So it seems like the possibilities have no end.